We humans, like all other species, are naturally exploitive. Except that now we have the capabilities, the tools, the energy resources to dominate this planet. What is it about the way we have evolved to think and act that is shaping this world that we have so recently created? Mankind faces a challenge unlike any other in its history. And it's a problem that evolution did not equip us to solve. We are living in a momentous time, facing our most important test ever. Is it even reasonable to believe that we who created the problem in the first place might also be able to stop it? And if so, allow future generations to avoid a desperate and deadly world left to them by us?
Welcome, everybody. My name is John Zavalny, and I'll be your host today as we talk about an intriguing new climate documentary produced by Jim Swift and directed by Susan Kuchera, titled The 12th Hour. Now, one thing that really got my attention, I thought was so intriguing, was the idea that our human evolutionary history may play a major role in how we think about and how we react to our warming planet. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to begin the conversation with telling you a little bit about my background. I retired after 30 years with the Los Angeles Unified School District, teaching middle school and high school science, biology, and environmental studies at the Fauché Learning Center. My real passion, though, is environmental education and helping inner city students to understand and experience the natural world. My wife and I saw former Vice President Al Gore tape his slideshow that later became The Inconvenient Truth. And once he announced I was going to train presenters, I applied and was accepted and was trained in the third group. I made it part of my job to provide climate education in as many classrooms and to as many students as possible, and quickly became one of the top presenters in the organization, which leads me to why I'm here today. I work with Michael Cahert at the Video Project, helping to provide environmental documentaries to schools. I provide educational components to the films, and I do in-classroom facilitation. I've already introduced several classrooms to the 12th Hour. Now, I'd never heard of the evolutionary mismatch theory before I watched the film. The idea that our society and the environment are both changing at such a rapid pace that our brains cannot evolve fast enough to deal with these new issues was something I had never considered before. Michael Ranney is a professor of education in the Dept of Psychology and the Graduate School of Education at the University of California Berkley. He and his collaborators conducted experiments in which he demonstrated that brief climate change interventions, texts, videos, graphics, statistics, and more, significantly increased the public's understanding and acceptance of global warming. His group's website, How Global Warming Works, is designed to enhance climate change cognition. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. You've been conducting some pretty interesting research on the public knowledge and understanding of climate change. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Basically, we have a little cottage industry of finding ways to change people's minds about climate change in that we're hoping to increase people's acceptance and concern about global warming. And we're up to about a dozen actual ways that we can change people's minds in like 5 minutes or less. Each one is about 5 minutes or less. And these have been empirically vetted. We actually run randomized controlled experiments to see that these work. And I guess the three most important things I could convey up front is that there are really very few people that understand the mechanism of global warming. That is how Earth is getting hotter. The good news is it can be explained pretty briefly. And, we have like 600 words, even 35 words. That I actually, when I give talks, I hand out a little card that has like 35 words on it here. It explains the mechanism of global warming. And what's nice about that is when you explain that to sort of secret knowledge that almost nobody knows, it boosts their understanding. So, unfortunately, less than 1% of Americans know this. And even there are a lot of scientists who are not climatologists that don't know this, like geology professors that I now collaborate with. And even a few graduate students in environmental sciences don't know why we're getting hotter. And so our website, How Global Warming Works, provides this information as well as a bunch of other, and you can go and have a look at our 35 words. I even got it down recently to a 13-word haiku, and it's not very mellifluous, but I can recite it. You have to know that the word folks is in there with a apostrophe after it, and that IR stands for infrared, but the haiku is basically, Earth turns sunlight to IR light that's sponged by folks, greenhouse gases glut. And the good news about global warming is that you can explain the nexus of it very briefly. That's a little too short for most people, but at least you get a sense.
Right. Yeah. When I started training with Al Gore, our slides kind of went through all of that, talking about the wavelengths coming from white light and hitting the earth, and it heats up, and heat is infrared, different wavelength, and getting through the atmosphere. And that whole kind of education is so important. In the 12th hour, you say that only 17% of people in the United States know that almost all climate scientists say climate change is happening. Actually, that was in a paper you did entitled Boosting Public Understanding, not in the 12th hour. But you said people don't trust the science or the seriousness of the climate threat either.
Well, I think, to be blunt, I actually do think that most Americans trust scientists, largely trust scientists, and even climate scientists, maybe a little bit less so. And one way to think about that is if, let's say, NASA scientists predicted that tomorrow at noon in Kansas City, there's going to be an eclipse. Well, imagine what would happen if it didn't occur. I mean, about 100% of Americans would be shocked by this, right?
Right.
Now, it's not that everyone can predict their own eclipse. It'd be hard for me to pull out a spreadsheet and try to figure it out myself, right? But we trust scientists to get a lot of science right. And so when science isn't right, it's usually because, or there isn't a trust for science, it's because the science is new, like, the mRNA vaccine scared people a bit. Or there's some sort of error or even a moral lapse, unfortunately, like, cold fusion didn't play out. Hubble had a bad mirror initially, and we had to fix the space telescope. Or, the unfortunate Tuskegee experiment, which is a moral lapse. Or finally, one reason people don't trust scientists as much as they should is that they're motivated people that are spreading false and misleading information, what's called agnotology, for their own personal gain, whether it's financial or tribal, or they just want to get more attention. But depending on how you word the question, most people trust climate scientists, even though it suffers from this agnotology sort of business. And they also spread this misinformation that the climate scientists don't agree with each other. Right. It's a little bit better than we published that paper, but there's still, 98% of climate scientists accept that human-caused global warming is going on, right?
Right.
And in fact, we've actually run a study recently where we increased trust in scientists by explaining to them what the reward structure of science is. And you can do it very quickly to explain. Well, of course, that's why you should trust scientists. In fact, when I give my talks around the country, I actually make a pledge which reinforces the notion that you should trust scientists. I can tell you the pledge if you're interested sometime.
Sure, let's go right ahead. Let's hear it.
So, it turns out the real scientists get rewarded for overturning earlier paradigms. Like Einstein didn't win the Nobel Prize by writing a little paper saying, I agree with Niels Bohr, right? He got it by coming up with something that was so novel that contradicted the prevailing wisdom. That's how real scientists sort of gain fame, right? And so if any scientist thought that they could disconfirm global warming, that they could prove global warming was a hoax, they'd do it in a heartbeat. They'd expect to win the Nobel Prize. They'd be the most famous scientist alive. People would buy them beer. They'd get a lot of money. So the notion that somehow scientists are just yes people that are just going along to get along is crazy. And most scientists would dearly love climate change to be false. I mean, I tell my audiences, I said, I'd be so ecstatic if global warming were a hoax and someone could please undelude me of this, that whoever it is, I would I would rent the largest SUV I could find, drive to wherever that person is, shake their hand. I'd quit doing work on this entirely, and I'd give back any dollar I ever got in climate change cognition. And I'd ask them if I could publish it and win the Nobel Prize. So the notion that scientists don't want to disconfirm global warming or just trying to go along is just malarkey.
Well, as a science teacher, part of what I try to teach the kids is that they learn more from mistakes. Science is about experimenting. And, if you're always successful, you're really not learning as much as you would from making, those mistakes and correcting them and trying new things. And, I think that's kind of part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get paid to do that that well.
Yeah.
And like what you're talking about, it's kind of like the peer review process that scientists go through to publish anything. I mean, when people peer review, they look for every little reason to discredit that writing. So scientists really get put through the ringer. A lot of people don't understand that process.
Right. And in fact, the truth about people with PhDs is that they have very low unemployment rate. So they can always get another job if climate change turns out to be a falsehood, right? So they're doing it because they love it. They find it interesting and they think that it's important to inform the public or better understand the phenomena. They're not doing it, just because they're trying to slurp up money from the NSF or some government sort of funding. There are a lot of other things that scientists could do than just looking at climate change if it turned out that it was baloney.
You're right about that. So you and your research are really data-driven. And I've listened to Katharine Hayhoe talk a few times, and she says that we've been talking about the data and the science for over 150 years and really haven't much progress in combating climate change. So, I got trained by the National Network of Oceans and Climate Change Interpreters to use, metaphors, explanatory metaphors and strategic framing and those kinds of things to talk about. So do you think that there is an overload on data and evidence for people and sometimes that turns them off?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack it there. I definitely think that one of the main problems in science instruction, especially from teachers and other instructors like professors and journalists, those two groups make up most of the information we get, is that they don't provide the most useful information. So often, like what we do is we focus on the bare bones science that most efficiently and quickly can help explain and change minds, right? And the way we think about it is even in the K through 12 group, for school children or teachers and so forth, if the goal is really to generate a wise electorate that will, vote well, then you really want to focus on the stuff that's most crucial and most important. Unfortunately, a lot of science education, whether it's public or in classrooms, is this big landslide of information. It's just, loosely connected information, or even when it's tightly connected, sometimes it's just too much and you lose the essence. So there are things about starving polar bears and wildfires and so forth. But the problem is that a lot of people miss the most essential part, like, why Earth is getting hotter in the first place. Once you know that Earth is overheating, it's a lot easier to incorporate these effects like bears and fires. And I know Katharine Hayhoe. In fact, I gave talks at her university when she invited me to. And I certainly appreciate the stuff she does in the field, especially talking with highly religious people.
Right.
And in fact, I gave one of my talks in a bar in Lubbock, Texas. So that was exciting. And I tend to think that metaphors are okay for teaching science, but I think some metaphors aren't very useful. Like, I'm not a big fan of the blanket metaphor for climate change because it sort of confuses where the heat source is and so forth. But I do think that really what changes people's minds is having a strong theory and some good evidence that complements it. Because, that's one of the reasons why people came to accept that smoking tobacco wasn't good for you, because in the end, there was a good biochemistry theory, and there was a lot of evidence that came together to convince folks. And I think one of the difficulties is that people assume that folks just believe what they want to believe, and that's not true. You know, people can change their minds. We're not in stasis. So, for instance, 3 months ago, there were some people that thought Russia was benign. You know, that it was even possibly enviable, that we didn't have to worry about it and so forth. But in just a few days, you know, that notion became pretty well disconfirmed, because there was evidence to support this theory that, you know, a totalitarian dictatorial regime with a lot of weapons is a dangerous thing, right? And so I think talking from the heart is a fine idea, but it depends on what you're saying, you know, because people often detect their emotional appeals and sometimes they reject them.
Right.
And so, like for me, I would prefer that Earth was at the center of the universe, right? Emotionally, I would be happier if Earth was the center of the universe. I'd feel more special and all, right? But I have to suck it up as an adult and accept that, you know, we're one rock circling one star in a big galaxy, and there are lots of galaxies, right? So speaking from your heart about the solar system doesn't necessarily convince you that heliocentrism, you know, the fact that we're circling the sun is true. So it's kind of complicated.
Yep, it is complicated. Now, you talked a little bit earlier about K-12 science and, you know, what you think, you know, happens. I've been in that realm for 30 years. And I have found that teaching to the test, for one thing, is a big problem, because federal funds depend on your test scores. And the schools were really pushing language arts and math, with science being kind of pushed off to the side and not getting as much recognition and support as it should have gotten. So I think part of that has to do with a little bit of the science of literacy that we have in our children today.
Yeah, definitely. I think literacy is a big part of it. And, you know, it's hard to say what's most fundamentally important in terms of literacy. You know, I think that sometimes people forget, like, the basics, you know, the fundamentals, because we're providing a lot of sort of auxiliary tangential things.
Right. And you had mentioned you went to Lubbock, Texas, and did a speech. I said that was interesting.
Yeah,
I went to college in West Virginia, a small school called West Liberty, and I went and did a climate presentation there. And I ended up getting a standing ovation, because I was talking about mountaintop removal and all the pollution and everything, and everybody's like, yeah. So, you know, I guess it depends on knowing your audience. And when you say talking from the heart, you know, talking about shared values. I think that's kind of hits it in the middle of the road, doesn't it?
It does. Like, I grew up in Colorado, and when I give a talk, especially, you know, places that might think that a Berkeley professor is trying to, you know, turn their kids into godless communists or something like that, I show this slide in my talk that says, "Hear me out, I'm not a commie," and it provides what one of my pals calls my redneck bona fides, you know, that I can shoot a gun, I've ridden horses, you know, all manner of things. I'm a crazy fanatic for the USA when the Olympics are on, because I think it's important that we realize that fundamentally we're really much more similar than we are distant. And unfortunately, some of the rhetoric that's been going on has sort of been causing us to think that we're more polarized than we really are. I mean, no one wants random murders to be okay, right?
Right. Yeah, I always kind of like to say that, you know, we are a divided country, but I think if you start talking to people and talking about things that you have in common, talk about the middle grounds, not the extremes on either side. We have much more in common, and we can get a lot more done if we just focus on that instead of the extremes.
For sure.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with the 12th Hour? You've been in other documentaries and stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, so they contacted me and wanted to know if I'd be interested in dusting off the information I have. And, you know, I've done a fair amount of experiments that sort of try to change people's minds. And I also have sort of developed a theory about why it is people don't accept information as well as they might, and how you can facilitate that. My background is mostly as an experimental psychologist, but my initial publications were actually in applied physics and material science. One of my degrees is in molecular biology.
Okay.
So I've largely been trained initially as a natural and physical scientist, and I came to love social sciences and the world of pedagogy later on. So it seemed like I filled the niche for the the producer and the director of the documentary to have me hold forth with my what little wisdom I have.
Well, we thank you for that. So do you think this documentary could shift perspectives and leave an impact? Why, and if so, in what way?
Well, definitely, I think that it can shift perspectives and be impactful. And I think part of it is that because it's about 50 minutes long, and yet it captures a fair amount about climate change. And if you compare that to, like, a student taking an entire earth sciences class, and yet still may not remember what the mechanism of global warming is later, this is a pretty good, impactful, efficient sort of way to offer it. And I think in particular, it shows the stakes about climate change pretty well, that the stakes humans are playing with in this sort of game of chicken with consumption and technology and growth in general. And I think that I like the evolutionary analyses, especially the part of me that actually has studied human cognition about evolution and so forth. But I do think that they might have slightly undersold the human brain, even though it evolved, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago more recently, because we really can understand the dangers that are facing us and plan deep into the future. So for instance, like a week or so ago, I actually generated a financial spreadsheet for my family that goes 70 years in the future. So, people can think about the future even beyond, their expiration date and so forth. And the important thing is that you really need to inculcate a sense of hope in people, because without hope, people tend to turn off if you are only offering dour survivalist sort of information. So it's great to have these discussions, and documentaries are a great way to connect with people that way.
Right, I appreciate that. And you just took away my next question, but that's good. So I lost my train of thought there for a second.
No worries.
So in California, Assembly Bill 130 passed the legislation in July 2021, and there's about $6 million allocated to contract for the creation of free and open sourced curriculum units on climate change, including environmental justice, integration of environmental principles and concepts. So what advice would you give to those who are developing those materials, and to a K-12 educator like myself who would be using them to be better inform the public about climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I was thinking back to you're mentioning Al Gore's film and training and so forth, and I'm a bit familiar since that's a documentary also. In fact, An Inconvenient Truth is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. And I've actually sat in and been at one of the trainings that you went to, by Al Gore and his team, and I found it very very valuable. And I understand that you've even adapted it since that training. But one thing that I thought I'd mention is that film, as great as it was, did a not so great job in explaining the mechanism of global warming. Because if you really analyze the film, which is a full-length film, there's only about 1 minute of explaining the mechanism. And that 1 minute is pretty good, but it sandwiches it in such a way that people are likely to forget it, because it sort of makes a joke afterwards and it sort of downplays it a little up front. So even in a full-length film, some information can't be as useful as it is. And the way that ties into the legislation you propose is because we really have to be very careful with the kind of curricula and information we provide. It's hard to be great on every aspect, as An Inconvenient Truth almost was, right?
Right.
And I certainly applaud the legislation, and I especially applaud the focus on justice and fairness, because without fairness, we're never going to have a solution to climate change. Because if some groups or some countries think that we are doing something that's not right, then there's just not going to be the wide international action that we really need. So fairness is always going to be at the center of it.
Right, and a lot of the arguments we get when we talk to people who don't really want to do anything is, well, if China and India are going to keep burning coal and doing nothing, why should we do something?
Right, yeah. Whereas they'd say, you folks have been you've been putting out greenhouse gases for centuries, and now, when you're all driving SUVs, you're closing the door behind us and telling us we have to walk or ride bicycles. So fairness cuts both ways this way.
Absolutely. You know, and we are all in this together. I mean, there's no question about it. There's no planet B.
That's for sure.
So we talked a little bit about documentaries. How can you make them more impactful for non-expert audiences? What could be done to make them, like you said, the inconvenient truth was, you know, sandwiching things in. There's too much information. And you talked about, you know, little tidbits of information. You think that's the best way to go with this?
Well, I think it kind of depends on how much time people have, how invested they are, and also, you know, the particular goals. Like science education goals are a little bit different than goals related to getting the electorate to understand something to the degree that they can vote well. I really do think that keeping something simple and especially accurate is really important, and focusing on the most crucial information, because a lot of information, whether it's in a documentary or in a curriculum, is just a little too involved. You know, curriculum designers fall in love with their materials, and it's very hard for them to be the kind of brutal self-editors they really need to be. But they should really be thinking about, you know, what's really important. If this student is not going to go on to be a climate scientist or an environmental scientist, I want to make sure that the student will at least know the right way to vote when he or she turns 18. Or, you know, if the person's 65. So like our website, How Global Warming Works, we see it as very pan-humanity. Like we want fifth graders to be able to access the information, and we want, you know, fifth graders in Ohio and 95-year-old Floridians or Arizonans to access it as well. And since my background is in, you know, running experiments, you know, I have a good sense of how to tell if some of these things work. And, you know, one of the most important things is to engage people not only intellectually, but also in terms of their motivation, right. You know, the desire and so forth. Although you don't want them so motivated that they just get scared and they turn off, because that's a danger with motivation. So good documentaries can interplay these well, and poor documentaries, especially if they're providing misinformation, are worse than any documentary at all.
Yeah. So you mentioned your website a little bit, and I have a question coming up about that. Now, you're a researcher, so are you collecting data on who's using your website, and is there any pre and post on that website to see if people are actually changing their minds and what they're learning?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we run studies both in more sort of laboratory bases where, you know, people are looking at these things individually, or we assess what people are doing online, you know, through Google Analytics or things like that. You can kind of tell what people are doing. And so, you know, we've run a lot of experiments. And if you go to our website, How Global Warming Works, you'll see not only the texts that explain the mechanism or the videos that explain the mechanism, but we have 7 very surprising statistics that I also have on a card that I give out to audiences. And it turns out that if people guess these statistics and then they get feedback on them, it increases their acceptance of global warming as well. And these materials also, whether it's the mechanism or the statistics, they also work for people who already accept global warming to a fair degree. You know, unless you're like at the ceiling of acceptance, because part of the problem is that even people who accept global warming, most of them don't know the mechanism either. So they're taking things often at the words of their professor or whatnot. So knowing the mechanism, knowing these statistics, or knowing the what the temperature over time looks like is really good also to be a better arguer. So like if you're in a pub or a restaurant and someone's arguing with you and they say, well, the person on the radio says it's not happening. And you say, well, my professor says it is. It's just 2 different information sources disagreeing, right?
Right.
So the important thing is to have data. So like one of the things that we provide are graphs. I don't know if I can get this up here, but you can sort of see there. Here are 2 graphs, and one of them is temperature over time from the 1880 to today, and the other one is the stock market over time from 1880 to today. And it turns out that people can't tell these apart, and they're obviously both going up. And so we have a little curriculum even about that you can see on our website, globalwarmingworks.org. And that's also very compelling because people say, oh, God, it's got to be going up. Look at the graph. And I can't even tell this from the stock market. So the website's been pretty successful. We started it around 2013. And after 5 years, we found that in the United States society, the people who most accept global warming in the United States had doubled. That segment of the population has doubled. Now, that's probably not just our website, because correlation doesn't always involve causation, but we're pretty happy about it. And we've spawned over 1 million page views. People in 200 countries have accessed our site. Tens of thousands of towns and cities. Every now and then it'll go viral in a particular part in the world, whether it's Austria or something like that, often because there's an article written about it.
Right.
So, and we've also been part of the CLEAN network, which is this K through 12 sort of collection of climate energy educational resources. So there are students in classrooms who are using our information. So we're pretty gratified about that as well. So we're interested in the old, the hard to convince, and the young, the easy to convince, and everything in between.
Yep. Now, I have to admit, I did go to your website and I saw those graphs, and I'm looking at them going, which one was which? Right. I couldn't really tell, but I thought the one that went up the fastest at the end was probably the temperature.
Well, you're right to be confused, but in fact, just to give you a sense about how hard a decision it is, I gave a talk at the University of Chicago's business school. And even these people that know all about finance, right, they couldn't tell which was the stock market and which one was temperature either. In fact, they were non-significantly in the wrong direction in their guesses. So now, depending upon you average it, it's a little easier because, like, if you look at an annual average, you'll see there's a little bit of a dip, which is more typical of stock markets than it is of temperatures, right? But the important thing is that if you really average it out to be like a 64-year moving average, then it basically just goes up like a jet plane. It's basically monotonically increasing that our temperature has been going up so regularly.
Right. Okay. So in 2021, you gave an Earth Day talk at Wichita State, and it was titled 10 Quick Tested Ways to Reduce Denial of Human-Caused Global Warming. I guess that's 12 ways now, right?
Yeah.
Towards the end of the talk, you talk about solutions and hope. And so, what are some of those recommendations or solutions of hope that you have that you'd like to share with us?
Right. So I guess I can say maybe I'll mention some of the ones of these 12 we've been looking at. I've mentioned some of them before, but I'll point out a few others. We actually have even when you take those misleading, those good statistics that explain climate change, and you mix them in with misleading ones, people can still tell which one are the better statistics, and that still increases people's acceptance. So that was interesting to know, because otherwise people say, well, as soon as they stop looking at your stuff and they look at contrary information, they're going to swing back the other way. But if you really compare them, people can tell the wheat from the chaff, which is, I think, important. Okay. One of the things we've also done is we've offered sea level rise information, whether it's maps projecting the future or even economic information about how even now people are paying more for housing that's away from the ocean than in like floodplains and things like that. We also have this thing that I call carbon dilupi, which is...
I like that.
Yeah, basically it turns out that if you have too much CO2 around your nostrils, you actually lose an IQ point or more. So when we give people that information, that causes them to worry about climate change too. Even though we don't mention climate change, it's just realizing there's yet another reason why a lot of carbon dioxide isn't good for you. And one of the things that we do that's sort of interesting also is if you just explain the carbon cycle, like how it is that carbon gets out of the atmosphere, which very few people know. I certainly didn't know that, or even the mechanism when I started this line of work. That's why I found it so intriguing. That changes people's minds as well. And in terms of hope, one of the things you can do that's really useful, and this is what work I've done with a doctoral student who's just about to get her PhD, Leela Valatham, we found that, for instance, if you give people surprising statistics about how much people can change their, how lightly they live on the land, or how much we can reduce certain emissions or certain pollutions and so forth. If you just give people statistics about what's already happened, that inculcates people with such a sense of hope that not only increases their hope about climate change, but also increases their acceptance that global warming and climate change is going on. So she's actually run 3 or 4 studies relating to hope. And so several of these, basically give you the sense that if we think about this, I mean, it may cost like, $25 trillion or something like that, to fix global warming. But, when it comes down to it, we have those resources. We've already been spending like $5 trillion a year subsidizing fossil fuels as a planet. So if you think about it, even $125 trillion is not too much to ensure that future generations will be happier and have better lifestyles, or even critters or plants that we love, or even landscapes that don't get sawn off, as you were sort of alluding to earlier. So I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful because because we can fix this, and we don't have to worry that there's necessarily a dystopian future, that we can make the future much better than it'll otherwise be. And the sooner we act on that, the better.
Yeah, that's the message I'd like to give my students too. I want to go back to your carbon dilupy thing because it reminded me of an experiment I did with my students. I was with the GLOBE program, Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment, and we got some air monitors. And and they collect a lot of different information. Most of the teachers took them out and were collecting information outside, looking for pollution and particulates thing. I was at a school that had a lot of these old bungalows on campus that were supposed to be there for 20 years, 30 years later kind of thing, And I was measuring CO2 in the classroom. And by the end of one period, the CO2 was off the charts. There's not enough circulation within the classrooms. So yeah, I know what you're talking about because my kids were kind of loopy in those classrooms sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, one of the experts on COVID that I listen to occasionally will say that she carries along a CO2 monitor just because if CO2 is high, it means that there's not good ventilation and she's got to put a mask on. So yeah, once it gets up over 700 parts per million, 1,000, 2,000, even if you're really in tight quarters, then you're breathing other people's carbon dioxide.
Well, I think we're starting to run out of time here. So I just want to really thank you for being here today. This has really been an interesting conversation. I enjoyed talking with you. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure too. I guess if I might just offer one last thing about what people can do.
Please.
Is that in spite of all the things you do in the home, like recycling and so forth, one of the most important things people can do is to call your representatives or send them an email, tell your senators, your president, your representatives, your rulers about your concern about the climate. And even more importantly, maybe almost more importantly, is that you vote for people who are going to inhibit climate change the fastest, because really that's the most important thing to think about, that although we do a lot of great stuff on the home front and we can change the future that way too, when it comes down to it, if you don't get government to cause us to act in better ways and give incentives for better behavior in terms of climate and environment, then things aren't going to work out so well, in spite of individuals wanting things to go good.
Yeah, a lot of individual change adds up to make a difference, but it's the systemic change that can happen through voting that we really need to focus on.
Right. So if someone came up to someone's house and said, look, I have some solar panels in my truck and I'm going to put them on your roof and it's going to save you a bunch of money and you'll be happier. And if you don't let me do that, the government's going to charge you $10,000. Incentives will get a lot more people to adopt solar panels, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, I think I'm going to leave us with a quote today from my good friend, Dr. Jane Goodall. She says, above all, we must realize that each of us makes a difference with our life. Each of us impacts the world around us every single day. We have the choice to use the gift of our life to make the world a better place or not to bother. Now, I wouldn't be here today, you wouldn't be here, and probably the audience wouldn't be here today either if they thought it was time to not bother. I think if you want to learn more about climate change in the 12th hour, join us tomorrow when we come back, and I'll be interviewing Dr. Ugo Bardi, professor of physical chemistry at the University of University of Florence. So thank you for being here. Michael, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and thank you, everybody.
My pleasure, too.